This is Conversations on Careers and Professional Life, a podcast from the Foster School of Business, MBA Career Management Office. I'm your host, Gregory Heller. On each episode, I talk with guests from faculty and staff to students and business leaders about the skills and strategies that can help you design a professional life that you're happy with. On this episode, I speak with Kristin Graham. Kristin has been with Amazon since 2016 and, among other things, has been one of the teachers of the Amazon narrative writing class that reaches tens of thousands of Amazon employees in 6 countries. She has a background working with nonprofits, as a journalist, and in corporate communications and employee programs. Kristin holds a master's degree in journalism from Northwestern University and an executive MBA from the University of Illinois at Chicago. In the fall of 2020, Kristin ran a session for our incoming MBA candidates in the class of 2022 and returned to deliver a few additional sessions on business writing and productivity for our students at Foster. I wanted to share some of her tips about communicating during the pandemic and business communications in general with you, my listeners. I think you'll find some great advice in this conversation on careers and professional life with Kristin Graham. So it is my pleasure to welcome Kristin Graham to this conversation on careers and professional life. Welcome, Kristin.
Thank you, Gregory.
So I really wanted to have you on the podcast because of the session that I saw you present to our incoming class of MBAs for the class of 2022, which was on business communication and business writing. And what I'd love to start off with, though, is a question that's been on my mind, which is, do you think that during this period of time, we're in the middle, hopefully middle of the COVID pandemic era where everyone is working from home, do you think that written business communication is more or less important than when we are working together in person?
Oh gosh, we're all trying to figure that out right now, but the short answer from what I have seen is it's more important because it's our primary communication forum right now. Not necessarily by desire, but by design. We're not having hallway conversations. We're not collaborating around a conference table. We are trying to make progress in as many mediums as possible, but written communication, email specifically, is predominant because it has to be.
So email is something that we're all pretty used to. But to replace those hallway conversations, we are looking towards chat platforms like Microsoft Teams or Slack, or probably a multitude of others. How do you think people can get up to speed quickly with the appropriate style of communication over these chat platforms?
So I'm going to get really nerdy really fast on you, so let's buckle up.
Good, let's jump in.
The aspect of what you just said is it's a chat platform. It's not a substitute for chat. It's an enabler of shorter bite-sized communications, but it is still written communication. And the fundamental science behind that is that you are still writing and pulling from that cerebral cortex of your brain, the executive functioning center, versus more the amygdala. When you're having a dialogue like you and I are having right now, we're engaging in more the emotional center of our brain. We have shorter sentences to each other. We have more natural pauses. We build on each other's conversations. We read our tones. But even in a chat platform, if you and I were doing this over Slack, there's that elongated pause. There's the more structured sentences. So it's still artificial in terms of chat, but it's very much a communication channel nonetheless.
So does that mean we need to pay even more attention or something different or different attention?
I think we just turn the dial slightly differently as we're moving between mediums. So when you and I are talking like this, we're going to establish very quickly a rhythm with each other. And we're going to explore topics likely at a faster pace. In a chat platform, I keep going back to that example, there's the give and the take, there's the pause and the wait. And with that, you're often formulating what your response is going to be while you're seeing the little thought bubble icon as somebody is typing back to you. And so it does adjust the way that we are engaging because it's not as quick synapses the way a conversation like this does. It is very much more give and take. Think of it as ping pong right? Versus like interactive element.
Yeah. There's nothing worse, right, than when you're iMessaging with someone and you see the dot 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 like they're about to type something, and then they go silent, and you you
Like
don't
nothing.
get anything for like minutes or hours or a day, and you're like, what were they going to say that they chose not
Exactly.
to say?
Torture. It's communication torture. And I'll tell you, for me, and I'm somebody who writes for a living, I can write pretty quickly. That was my journalist roots. But when I am having, whether it's the keyboard or my thumbs, I become the world's worst typist. And then I'm backing up and then I'm trying to say it again and I'm losing my thoughts. And it's very frustrating as the speaker, much less for how the recipient is on the other end of Kristin back there. So
Yeah.
I think we're all struggling to maintain that spontaneity of conversation when really what we're having to do is go through screens of some sort.
Do you think we should just pick up the phone more often?
I do. I do. However, I have teenage boys, and for them, I called my son yesterday. I was driving somewhere, and it was like an interrogation. Everything was a yes or no with him. And I was like, do you want me to let you go? He's like, well, I already texted you. So I think that we are losing our conversational muscles for sure. But if we're going to talk about career and we're going to talk about business, I think that more can get done in a very short interpersonal conversation where possible. And by the way, I mean a conversation like this versus the screen overload that we're doing. When we're getting on Zoom, there's still that artificial element of how we're communicating. There's something very liberating about an actual phone call, a conversation where you're not, quote, on. I have had better one on ones over these last few months where I throw on my shoes and go out for what I'm calling a walk and talk, because we're not doing all of that artificial volleying of email or of chat platforms. We're actually just engaging. And I think that's especially important right now, Gregory, because we're in the middle of this extended, distant time, that what's being lost in all of our written communication mediums is connection. So I really like your idea about throwing on a headset and getting on the phone with somebody, because you and I are going to be more connected with each other. And I would argue have a richer conversation because we're doing it this way than admiring each other's words through a back and forth.
And being distracted by our own preview image, right?
Oh my gosh, that is one of the worst things I wish we could do. Because when we're talking on the phone, you don't have to look at me, I don't have to look at you. So we can engage in the conversation, the art of the conversation. But you're right, when we're in that artificial means through our webcams, our brain is understandably and naturally going to be taking in all of that visual, and they're not focusing so much on the art of the conversation.
You know, one of the things that you talked to the students about, you gave some what you called RSS, ridiculously simple steps
Mm-hmm.
to sort of like hacking productivity or hacking distraction or hacking focus. And I wonder if this falls into that category, right, of deciding when to be on a video call versus when to be on a phone call, when you can, liberate yourself from the desk and the desktop and all the distractions that might be there pulling at you, even though you're on video with this person, to get up and, like you said, go for a walk and talk where you can be, even though you are not sitting there with the person and you might be walking down the street, you can almost be more present with the ideas of the conversation.
Absolutely. And I feel like, especially during these times, and I teach to hundreds of people every week. I've taught globally, especially during this time. And the one universal theme, and I think I shared this when you saw me speak too, is we've never worked so hard to feel so mediocre. Our times have been
So true.
extended, the things that we have to pay attention to. And one of the things I want to liberate us all from is that when you're feeling overly distracted, it's not a statement on your abilities. Your brain is actually doing what it is fundamentally wired to do. It's paying attention to all of those inputs in your surroundings and doing its very best to process. So when it's 11 a.m. and you're feeling exhausted already, and you're thinking, oh gosh, I guess I just need more caffeine. having that, removing, liberating, to use your word, those distractions is how you can be more productive in that space. If I'm talking to you on my computer and I'm looking at my preview window, I'm looking at you, I'm looking at the slides that you're showing, I'm listening to you through my speakers, maybe those are working or not so great today. And then I've got a flashing thing happening on the bottom of my screen because somebody on Slack needs me. My phone just buzzed over here, even though I put it on vibrate. My dog now knows that Amazon's delivering something. Your brain is making sense of your environment. It's trying to protect and respond to all of the stimulus. Whereas when I'm standing up and going for a walk and I'm just focused on the auditory of listening to you, my brain actually has more bandwidth to take in our conversation.
I think that's a really great point to make, and something that in my reading about all of these distractions and brain science, this idea that we are experiencing like a cognitive overload, a constant state of cognitive overload because of all of the signals that we're trying to interpret or that we are trying to resist, that sort of break our willpower, right? Because I'm not going to check that. I'm not going to check that. I'm not going to check that. And you talked about this ridiculously simple step, a ridiculously small step of turning off your notifications on your phone, of resetting your phone's do not disturb time.
Yes.
And I think these are all great, and I do many of them. And I've told students and worked with students to talk about some of these. But I wonder if when we shift into the realm of a student who is preparing for interviews and is going to be interviewing for a job or an internship and doing that remotely using some type of virtual platform, what are some of the things that you think would really help focus that attention and avoid the distraction?
Goodness. So let's stay on this ridiculously small step element, because I think all of us right now, any advantage, any edge we can give our brain will actually help us both feel more productive but show up better. So I want to go back to what you said. Let's say a student is engaging with somebody in an online, in a conversation, an interview. One of the super smallest things that you can do, because we all have quite an attachment to our phone, this is going to sound really minor, but turn it over. Turn it upside down so that you're not seeing the notification. So you might have turned it off. You might have it on do not disturb, but that doesn't mean that the screen won't pop up. One of the things I want your students to really think about is the multisensory experience of being focused on your conversation. So we talked about auditory earlier, but optically, just through our eyes, turning our phone over, it's one less thing that's going to potentially grab the attention so that you can focus on that conversation. And of course, logging out of all of the different things, log out of Slack, not just like turn it off, but log it out, so that we're reducing all of the potential distractions. And what you're doing there is giving the courtesy to the person you're having the conversation with, but you're also to your brain so it can stay focused on the conversation at hand. So one of the other ridiculously small steps that I have really been employing, in fact, I'm doing it right now with you, when you're having a conversation where you have key points you want to get across or key things that you have prepared in response to questions, such as in an interview, I have index cards that I put in front of me by category. And so if I'm interviewing at Amazon, for instance, and I know they're going to ask me technical questions, I have my response or my examples, but I've also written them out in very short bullets so that I tactically have them in front of me visually. Oftentimes when we're in the middle of a conversation and people ask us a question, our brain starts bouncing around. If you can glance down and see your key phrases, your key words, think of it like search engine optimization for your conversation. So I have those written in front of me so that in case my brain wants to pick down and get the key words, and it's triggers. Think of it like a teleprompter for your brain. So I've been doing that when I'm engaging in Zoom chats or online, where if nothing else, your brain feels there's some organization in front of you, but also it can be a visual reminder to keep you on task and on point. It's very easy right now to go on tangents in our conversations, and especially when you're nervous, when you're talking to somebody for the first time or you're being interviewed. So that gives you a tactical center to refer back to.
And when
Small.
you don't have all the visual cues from the other people you're speaking with because you're only seeing their head in the box.
Right. And they may be taking notes. So they may be typing, they may be writing something down. So you're not maintaining as much eye contact and body language. That's such a great point that you just said. As human beings, we read all of our visual cues in conversations. And so we are limited now because of the screens. So within that, it also gives you something to focus on so that you're centered. And then this is important in communication, it helps you speak better, faster, meaning
I,
know your point, stick to your point.
Yeah, I too have my paper notebook here with some notes for this conversation on it, things that I want to be sure to get to, and I'm a big fan of that connection between the mind, the hand, the pen, and the paper, and the impact that that can have in sort of solidifying learning and organizing thought beyond what would happen just in writing things on a screen, typing them in.
That's such a good point. I call it my command center. It's Kristin's brain's cheat sheet. I was talking to somebody recently and he is being interviewed by the media. And I said, "Tell me how you're doing that when you're being interviewed." And he said, "Usually I'm pacing around the room trying to respond to their question." And so for you and I, we like the tactical nature of paper. Other people are going to respond to different stimuli. So for him, he got very large, those white large post-it notes, almost sheets of
Yes.
paper, and
Yeah.
he put them in colors because that's how he responded by his core areas, and he wrote them in markers and colors, and he had them on his wall because he still wanted to walk. He had that kinetic energy, but then they became his visual command center so that as somebody was asking him a question, he would stand in front of that large poster and speak to that. Some people want to stand when they're talking. That really activates their brain. For you and I, we like that element of visuals on a pen and a paper in front of us. It's less about one tried and true way and more about responding to how you are naturally wired.
Yeah, finding what works best for you.
Absolutely.
I want to move on to the topic of writing, which was what really first attracted me to the idea of having you on the podcast because it is so important in the way we communicate. And since we are communicating so much by email, let's talk about your key tips for effective email communication.
Absolutely. So I think there's a lot behind just the volume itself. You said something earlier about cognitive capacity. So we're seeing on average since March of 2020, early research is showing that people are getting about 31% more emails just in the last 6 months. So it is the primary driving force of that. But what that does is it changes the nature and the timing of when and how people are responding to our emails. So specifically to your question, there's three key ridiculously small steps that I would absolutely encourage people to try out in their email communication. The first is your subject line. So many of us tend to skip over that and go right into the body of what we're writing. Think of that as the headline on your press release. Think of that as the television broadcaster saying, "Coming up at 9 a.m., we're going to talk about this." That's your hook. And so many of us overlook the subject line as almost a perfunctory element. Two lines, CC line, subject line. Now let's get into it. I want you to really be thinking about your subject line as prime real estate right now. It does not need to be a full sentence. Your subject line should not have punctuation, my friends. Your subject line should have a verb, it should have a call to action, and it should be very clear why somebody should engage with that. Most people are engaging first with emails on a mobile device and or a preview pane if they're on desktop. Research shows from user interface that you get about 4 seconds of where they're either reading your subject line or they're engaging with your preview. 4 seconds. And that is how the other person is saying, am I going to look at this now because I have 8 minutes before my next meeting, or am I going to come back to it later? So your job with your subject line is to hook them into engaging with it immediately. So within that, you want to have a verb. That's my ridiculously small step. The other thing I like to do in my subject lines is to say FYI only, or action needed, response by end of day Thursday. Tell them this isn't where we're being courteous. This isn't where we're building our relationship. This is where you're grabbing their attention. This is the billboard on the highway as their brain is driving by your email.
Yeah, the one that says next rest area 2 miles.
Right. You don't need to be creative and clever in that. You need to know where the rest stop is. So subject line, absolutely give it some attention. Don't overthink it. You want to get into your email, but be very clear. Why should they pay attention? Why should they take your exit? I'm stealing your analogy.
Yeah, go for it. So that's the subject. Now we move to the body. And usually the first thing in the body is some type of salutation. What are your tips there?
So a salutation should be short and sweet. The other thing I want to say before you get into that, one of the other tips I've seen a lot to be effective is what's your bottom line on top. I have seen even before the salutation, people who will say, and it could be in bold or italics, or it could just be its own sentence. This message is being sent to all people managers in North America. Now that's when we're in a work setting like you and I would be. But if you're in a career conversation or you're reaching out to somebody, the salutation is very important, but it's brief. This isn't an elongated introduction with a handshake. People are busy and you want them to get to that next thing. So I'm a big fan of just saying, hi, Gregory, dash, new line, and I get right into it. You don't need to go into hope you had a great weekend. You can use that sometimes with your closing, kind of a very quick courtesy element, but do a quick salutation. And that's, by the way, if we're talking about one-to-one emails. If it's one-to-many, that's when I was using that idea of who's getting this and why. But for your students, it'd be very quickly, hi, Kristin, dash, I'm reaching out to you about the open position at Amazon, et cetera, et cetera.
And then on length, the advice that you gave in the workshop was to try and keep it under 111 words. And that research, I believe, came from what some journalistic organizations have looked at in terms of how long people read articles before they drop off. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. Well done. Good memory, sir. So what the research has shown, it was from the Associated Press, is that you have 111 words typically before you lose half of your audience. So that is not to say I don't want anybody out there freaking out that they have to write emails in 111 words. I will pause and say that 111 words is actually longer than you think it is. What I am saying in this conversation is pay attention to your first 111 words, because those are the ones that are going to get the fullest attention. You can absolutely have more information after that, but you want to priority stack it. Like a traditional pyramid, the most important thing should be on the top.
And you recommend editing. Is that right?
Absolutely. I think any of us who have written an email at 9:00 at night on our couch and felt pretty good about it, and then the next day seen it and been like, oh my gosh, how did I miss that? Or I forgot to put that in there. I can't believe I misspelled it. I think that editing is the bar raising for writing. People worry so much about, I'm not a big communicator. People tell me that all the time. This isn't my native language. I'm a technologist. Kristin, I'm not a communicator. We're all communicators. We get through our day by communicating. Editing is where you give yourself space and grace to come back and just polish what you were meaning to say.
I know that there's usually this temptation, right, to fire off emails, right? You read the email, you respond to the email, you get it done, sent, on to the next one. But oftentimes I think that writing the email is a process in organizing your thoughts on the subject, and that when you go back and reread it just before sending it, you realize, like, not just that there maybe are some typos or some syntax can be cleaned up, but that you can actually really shorten it significantly because you've sort of done this work of processing as you're putting it on the page, and then the editing is that refinement that lets you make it more concise and even more clear for the person reading it. And I think, and I often advise people in terms of presentations, that you really need to think about what your audience needs to know. And I think if we address emails in the same way and we think, like, what does the person receiving this really need to take action, to respond clearly, so that there isn't like a volley back and forth of, well, I'm unclear about what you're saying here, and then you have to reply to that. So I think that that's where editing can really be powerful.
Absolutely. The first thing I teach anybody, whether they're doing narrative writing or in person conversation, or especially emails, is write messy. I know that for me, when I am looking at a screen, whether it's a Word document, a Google document, or an email icon, what I'm doing is just trying to get the thoughts out of Kristin's head. So that's writing messy. Editing gives you the space to go back exactly to what you just said and then be reader obsessed. That's where you change and establish your reputation. So when I'm writing my first draft of an email, I'm writing messy. What do I want to say to Gregory? What do I want to get out there? But when you go back on your second pass, it is polishing. But I want to go to what you just said. You can then trim out interesting over relevant, because what's interesting in my brain may not be relevant to Gregory. And so being able to go back in that space, look at it again, not from now I captured everything from my brain, to what does he need to know? What does he need to do? And by when? That's really all your emails need to be.
And I think that the bottom line up front, or the bottom line on top advice, people should realize that sometimes, or most of the time, you have to write that bottom line after you've written the message.
Absolutely.
Because you might not have gotten to what that bottom line is until you've put your thoughts out on the paper, organized them, and then you realize, okay, this is a kind of long email. What's the bottom line here that they really need to know right now? And let me write it in 2 or 3 sentences right at the top.
Well, and I love that you said that, because another very human nature thing of what we've done, and it comes from our academic upbringing, it comes from our linguistics, is we are naturally storytellers. When you sit down with somebody at a coffee shop, you're not usually blurting out your bottom line on top. We're telling the story. Let me take you through it. And so it is the excavation when you're writing messy that you get to wind out that story, and you usually come to that core point somewhere as you're writing. And then the art of revision is that you get to reorder it. It's a beautiful thing to be able to put that up there. And then you can back that in and tell the story. But because we're doing it in email or narrative forms, people need to know. In journalism, they say, tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them. That's the reinforcement of recall. And so from an email perspective, tell them up front, hi, Gregory, I'm really excited to be on the podcast. Thank you for the opportunity to do that. Here are my available times. Instead of, hey, I was thinking about the podcast and I'm going to brainstorm on some things. We need to go from conversational to concise. And that's what that space is to come back and to do.
Well, it's funny, you sent me an email earlier this week just confirming things. And when I replied back, I actually did a word count, and my message back to you was 119 words. So I felt like I was following the instructions pretty well, and I didn't have to edit it to get it down to 119 words. So I think it's coming somewhat naturally to me. I want to run through a couple other things that you said that really resonated with me. You said business communication equals business reputation. Mm-hmm. And I thought that in this time, especially when we are not face-to-face, when we are not having the conversations, it is the communication that we share, whether that is a memo, a report, or just an email, that really builds up our reputation with the people that we're working with.
Absolutely. And one of the things, especially right now, is being clear and being concise, is being courteous to other people. Now, there's a difference between, and I work in technology and I have for a long time, there is a difference between getting a note that says, get me your data by Thursday.
Right.
That's clear, that's concise, maybe it's courteous, but we still need to have our elements of communications with our dash of humanity. That's my takeaway in all of this, is we want to respect everybody's time. We want to understand that this time is extended right now, but we still want to have that art of connection. So we can have that sprinkled in there, but the crux of it needs to be, here's what I am needing from you. Here's what I am giving to you. Here's when you're going to hear from me again. because what you're doing is really answering questions before they're asked. The best communications when it comes back to business reputation, if I don't have to respond to you with a bunch of additional questions, you're saving me time. That helps the reputation. A lot of things when you're writing messy, I try to anticipate what's the and then, the so what, the what next. Because when I'm writing, first of all, I'm telling everything that makes sense in Kristin's head. When I'm coming back and looking at it again, I'm thinking, what else might he ask me? That if we were in person, if we were in that hallway, he would say, well, tell me more about that. Where else have you worked? What day? What Thursday? What time zone? We're taking those extra steps absolutely differentiates you from the other 199 emails that they're going to be dealing with that day.
Yes, I think that the word that you used or the phrase you used is to be reader obsessed. Mm-hmm. And just want to underscore that, to really think about what the person reading this message needs from the message and what you need them to have.
And they don't need your backstory and they don't need your life story.
So you also said shorter sentences, write a little bit more like we speak, and to get attention, be clear and write less. It reminds me of the line that is, I believe, attributed to Mark Twain. If I'd had more time, I would have written a shorter letter.
Absolutely.
So It takes an investment of time on the writer's side to be courteous for the reader.
It really does. And it also helps elevate how you're going to stand out. And I think right now, the fact that we're having this conversation at the time that we're having it, we are reliant upon these communication channels to help establish our reputation and our relatability. So investing a little bit extra into how we're showing up online is an investment in long-term effect of our careers and of our network.
And I think that for students, they're interacting with their classmates and their professors also virtually and by email and by chat over various chat platforms. Each of those interactions is an opportunity to practice this communication skill, to refine it, and at the same time to build your business reputation.
Absolutely. And here's another thing that we tend to do as we are being polite, especially coming into the working world. We're all trying to figure that out. One of the things I have seen routinely in corporate is you don't have to send back an email to acknowledge that you got the email. You don't have to say, thank you, got it. Right. Now, we tend to do that when we're more in person because that's conversational snippets. But in email, I think we're all trying to figure out what feels rude. I work with so many multicultural and international people in the course of my job and in my students. And I get a lot of, but Kristin, it just feels rude if I'm not saying, how are you? How's your family? And I totally understand all of that. And the indication is to say, thanks, have a great weekend. And while you can do that in your conversations when you're on the computer or like this, what you're doing though, by wanting to be courteous, is giving them one more email that they have to engage with. So that is one thing I would like to have people release themselves from, is you don't have to always do the acknowledgement.
I just received one of those yesterday from someone, and I thought, unnecessary. Because when you see it in your inbox, you're like, you think that it is something else, right? Yeah. That it's not just the thank you, that it's a continuation. So you're like, oh, well, I better get back to that because we were just exchanging. There must be something else this person needs. And you open it up and it's just the thanks so much. And you're like, oh, okay, well, that's, 6 seconds that I'm not going to get back. And that's one less email I'm going to get through today because I looked at that email.
But let me say something clearly to your students who are probably listening to this right now. We are not asking you to remove courtesy from your interactions with people. We're saying redirect it to the right forum.
That's great. And these are some subtleties that we are all learning right now. Everyone is, not just the people who are entering, let's say, a new field or, thinking about pivoting into a new industry, but it's everyone who's in that industry is also trying to figure this out, because this is a new paradigm for all of us.
I want to go back to something you said early in this podcast about greetings and salutations. One of the things I'm doing as I'm working on all these muscles of having shorter notes is I'm using my sign off as a bit of that personality. And we had this conversation with the first year class. That's when I'll say, have a great weekend. Hope you and your family are well. Really appreciate your time. So I'm using that quick thing right before my name to have that human exchange without then putting 3 more sentences.
And also without putting distance between the opening and the important part.
Exactly. Our tendency in emails is to then go into the conversation the way we would if we sat down next to each other. But really, from an email perspective, get to the point and then use your conversational element as your sign off. And I know for a lot of people that feels inverse, but really you're giving me the option to get into what is needed. And then you're giving me the sign off as that professional wave. Think of it that way. But I don't need to talk about the weekend and have all of that up front. I need to know what I need to know. And then it's just like, thanks so much. Have a great weekend. There you go.
I want to touch on one other thing. I love this way that you explained active voice. So could you just explain it again? Because I don't want to. I want to give you the opportunity to use this wonderful line that comes from your experience as a journalist.
Okay. Yeah, no pressure, but let me just have a wonderful line here. So the thing that I'll say and you said it earlier with the chat platforms, one of the things that we can all work on doing is using more active voice. And active voice means where it's very clear what the subject is and the verb is. The subject is the actor and the verb is the action. And so it automatically makes shorter sentences. And one great way to test that is most of us, when we speak to each other, like you and I are doing now, we speak in active voice. We speak in shorter sentences. And a primary driver of that is we're using breath. We have more punctuation because we're speaking. Something happens when we go to our screens or we're typing with our thumbs. I joke that we become Shakespearean. All of us, especially when you're doing something to a professor or to a potential person at a company. You're trying to be courteous, and what you're doing is being overly formal. And so we elongate that, and we all have our catchphrases. But what we do a lot, and by the way, in reading and entertainment, passive voice is very normal for how we tell compelling stories in entertainment. In communication, when we talked about courtesy, it comes back to be brief, be bright, be gone. So within that space, it's coming in, and we tend to write, when we write passive, what we're dropping a lot is the action or the actor. So we're dropping the verbs or we're dropping the subjects. And you don't often notice it because our ear gets, and our eyes get very trained to passive voice. And so the tip that I shared that I believe that you're referring to is from journalism. I got this a long time ago, but we call it the zombie tip. And it goes like this. If you're reviewing your sentence and you can insert the words by zombies after your verb and your sentence still makes sense, that means you're writing in passive. And passive means you've dropped the subject. So when you can insert by zombies, you can then tell the fact that you've been writing in that more artificial way. And it seems crazy when they're hearing it right now. It's when you take a look at a sentence and you say, the new sales incentive plan will be delivered quarterly. And if you go back in there and say, by zombies, you can tell, oh, I wrote that backwards.
Yeah. I loved it. It was great. I will put a couple examples in the blog post accompanying this podcast
Yes.
so that people can get an idea of it.
Well, and what I want to say on that too, though, Gregor, because I've taught this around the world, it doesn't have to be zombies. When I was in Korea, they decided to change it to Hello Kitty. Okay. And then it's hilarious when you're looking at your writing and you realize how much Hello Kitty is involved in your writing. And it's just a great tip to turn it back around and be like, let me just say that more clearly.
The most valuable thing that I learned probably in my 5 years of higher education that I participated in, my undergrad and my master's degree, was in my first freshman seminar when my instructor, my professor, told me, you're going to get these papers back from me and there'll be more of my ink on them than yours. You'll thank me for it. And yes. I became a relentless editor of my writing because of that. And I encourage students all the time when they're writing cover letters, especially when they're writing their resume, how can you say it in fewer words? And how can you say it more directly? And how can you use more of that active voice? I think those are some great lessons for clear communication.
And I love that you shared that because it carries over into your entire career journey. It'll go as you're leading meetings, as you're working with clients and customers. That conciseness drives action. Those actions drive results, and that's how business is done. The relationship comes from your day-to-day working experience, but your communication at work is there to drive results.
I think we're going to have to leave it there. I want to thank you so much, Kristin, for coming on Conversations on Careers and Professional Life to talk about communication and writing. And I want to give you an opportunity to let us know where we can find out more about you.
This was so much fun. I nerd up on this all day long, so I appreciate even just having the space to have the conversation. So thank you, Gregory. Thank you, Dub. So much respect for all of you. And you can find me on LinkedIn, of course, but I also have my own site called KristinGrahamComms.com. That's KristinGrahamComms.com. So come be a word nerd with me anytime. I really, really love this subject.
And I will put a link to that in the show notes, of course. Thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thank you, my friend.
Kristin offered some great advice for communicating during the pandemic and business communication in general, like using that subject line to capture your reader's attention, keeping your messages short, putting the bottom line on top, and being reader obsessed. Check out conversationsoncareers.com for the show notes and links to Kristin's website. If you enjoyed this episode, another you might enjoy is my conversation with Rob Cottingham on communication and public speaking. Thank you for listening to another episode of Conversations on Careers and Professional Life. I'd love to hear what you think about the podcast. You can email me at gheller@uw.edu. And if you've enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend or classmate.